So John Fieberg will be giving the talk. John is a professor of quantitative ecology in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota. Much of his recent research has been focused on the development of models of animal movement and habitat selection, including extensions that allow one to relax common assumptions, address individual variability, and evaluate model fit. John.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so it's always hard to follow Todd because he gives very interesting, thought-provoking talks, and he's also just an incredible teacher with a clear way of describing things. And probably the best way to solve the first problem is to give a talk not on modeling, but what your grad student has done, which is actually interesting, but that doesn't solve the second problem in clarity because this is really David's talk. And so I was one of David's PhD supervisors with David Anderson, and my background's in quantitative ecology. So when we get to the question section, we definitely need 2 mics because I'm going to probably need some help maybe with answering some of the questions. But I'm going to do my best. And David, the reason he's not giving this talk is he lost his voice this week, and so I offered to kind of step in, and he can correct me and pass notes to Todd if I say something that's really off. So. Okay, so I'll be talking about some of David's work from his PhD thesis, looking at trumpeter swan movements. And so this slide's probably for me, trumpeter swan ecology. Some of you may know more about trumpeter swans than I do, but they're the largest waterfowl species in North America, and Dave and I were talking about this possibly in the world as well. They've got a long neck for foraging on submerged aquatic vegetation. They're long-lived, 20-plus years, and their behavior, they form monogamous pair bonds, defend long-term territories. The young imprint on migration periods during the first year, and they have high site fidelity. And so we're really interested in movements of swans and their movement patterns, migration patterns. And so those biological aspects about how they learn to migrate are really important. I often don't get to do slides with a lot of beautiful pictures, so this is an opportunity for me. Here you can see that they use their long necks to be able to acquire food that other dabbling ducks can't access. They'll form nests from muskrat houses, and they'll use the emergent vegetation for concealment from predators. So this is their sort of ideal habitat, would be wetlands with submerged aquatic vegetation and insect abundance that they can access for food. One of the other really cool things is that they require about 100 feet for takeoff. So they need some space there, and they have these big webbed feet, which they actually use to incubate the eggs and transfer the heat from their feet, which is really interesting. There's not great historical information about their range, but this is probably the best that we can do. You can see they were widespread throughout Canada, Alaska, and northern states here. But that all changed in the 1800s. A lot of the population trends, the downward trends, were driven by market hunting. So this gun, called a punt gun, could shoot 50 birds in one shot. There was no regulation on hunting, and so that had a huge impact on trumpeter swans. By the late 1800s, they were on the verge of extinction, and really, one of the things that made a huge difference was the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, which prohibited the take of migratory birds unless allowed by regulations or permits, and so that put an end to market hunting. By 1886, there were over 5 million birds killed each year for North American millinery trade. So you can see feathers were used in these fancy hats. And you had the Gilded Age in the 1870s to 1890s, where you had these really just elegant hats and One of the interesting tidbits here that David shares when he gives this talk is on the Titanic's maiden voyage, over 40 cases of feathers were destined for New York milliners and the most expensive thing on board on the ship. You don't tend to hear that when you think of the Titanic. The crates were insured for over $2.3 million in today's dollar. So really interesting time period. You also had feathers used for quills and for powder puffs and things like that. So quickly, by the early 1900s, the interior population of trumpeter swans were decimated, and there was just one little remnant population here. In 1935, the Red Rock Lake National Wildlife Refuge was created to protect those birds. In 1959, they discovered another population of swans in Alaska. In the 1960s, the Rocky Mountain population was used to reintroduce trumpeter swans to the high plains. And then in the 80s and 90s, the swans from the Pacific Coast population in Alaska and the Rocky Mountain population were used to introduce trumpeter swans to Minnesota. And then in the 2000s, those reintroduction efforts expanded to other states in the Midwest. So one of the interesting things here is that these different populations have different migratory characteristics. So the Pacific Coast population in Alaska migrates down the west coast, whereas the Rocky Mountain population is non-migratory. And so we've got a mix of these birds that have been used to reintroduce and build up the interior population. They brought eggs from Alaska. Some of this was done with Three Rivers and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. We also had birds that were released from Minnesota zoos and from other private breeders. So we have this really interesting mix of birds that were used to reintroduce the population. And again, some of those birds came from migratory populations and others came from the Rocky Mountain population, which is non-migratory. Initially, the goal for Minnesota was to have 15 breeding pairs, and then that was increased to 500 birds, and you can see we've well exceeded that. And the population has really continued to grow very quickly. So this would be one of the winners on Todd's slide. But we still don't know a whole lot about the movements of these birds, and so that really was the motivation for the study. Okay. So some of the goals here were we just wanted to know some basic ecology. What proportion of the interior population is migratory and what are the extents of their movements? We want to be able to quantify their migration phenology. When do they start moving away from their breeding areas, summer areas? And how do their movements differ depending on breeding status and the latitude of their summer locations or breeding locations. So to figure this out, we marked swans we captured them during when they were molting, so they couldn't fly, and we collared them to track their movements. So to do that, I went out once with David and was unsuccessful, and I don't know if that was due to me or to David, but essentially we use these. We, being the royal we, David and his technician, use these flat-bottom boats so they can get into these different areas and be able to capture swans when they were unable to fly. Once they were captured, he took blood samples so that he could look at lead exposure and quantify genetics, and then put one of these little white collars on their neck, which then transmits locations every 15 minutes to cell towers. And so we can track the movements of these swans at a really fine scale. The collars are solar recharged, so best to get before putting them on to charge these things, and in the summer when you're in your flip-flops. And then one of the things that was really cool about this study is we initially got funding from LCCMR, from lottery funds here in the state, to collar swans, but then we were able to expand those efforts and collar swans in Canada and in Ohio and Michigan and Iowa, and expand those efforts. So this plot shows all the different locations where we collared swans in the summer, and we followed them from 2019, or we captured them between 2019 and 2022. So 113 different collars and 126 different swans that we were able to follow. We put some of when a swan would die, we try and get that collar and put it on a new individual so we could continue to track movements. So this figure shows each line is a different swan, and it shows the time period over which we were able to track the different swans. We had 14 in Minnesota the first year, and then we collared another 56 afterwards, 11 in Manitoba, 12 in Iowa, 20 in Ohio, 9 in Wisconsin, and then 4 in Arkansas. And these collars will last up to 5 years. One of the challenges here was when cell phone technology switched to 4G and 5G, these collars no longer performed well. And so you can see that's when we really had the drop-off. So to quantify annual movements, the first thing that David did was to try and think about how do I quantify the extent of movements and the timing of movements. And so one of the ways that he did that was he looked at distances, daily distances from where the swan was at each time point from where they were captured. So to kind of walk you through this slide, this is a distance of 0, says that this swan was really close to where it was captured. And then at some point it starts to migrate. This is the farthest distance it obtained from where it was captured. And then eventually it returned, had a little stopover site, and made it back really close to the area where it was captured. So David took these data and then used a statistical technique to quantify and fit a model that could be used to quantify migration phenology. This is probably an area where I'd be more comfortable, but maybe you're less interested. But essentially, you can think of these models as having these jumps in them to identify different areas that are used for stopover sites. So you get a jump here from where the swan was captured and its breeding location. There's a stopover site, and then you have the wintering area. And so to quantify how far it moved, we looked at the difference between its breeding site to this farthest travel location. And then the jumps in these distances we used to determine migration phenology. So the timing when they left their summer areas and then returned in the fall. You probably really don't want to see that slide. I think David put that in there just for me to have some equations. We'll get rid of those. But essentially here we have a plot of how far they moved on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have their breeding latitude. So one of the things that's really interesting when we first saw this, we looked and we said, it looks like there's sort of two different groups of birds. Some individuals that are moving a certain distance that depends on the breeding latitude, where if they're farther north, they're moving farther south in the winter, and they kind of follow this sort of linear pattern, where there's other individuals that are just look like they're trying not to move, but at some point, if they're really far north, most of those start to have to leave as wetlands start to freeze up. So we fit these models that allowed us to categorize or classify each individual according to one of these two tactics. So whether they were migrating a longer distance or they're trying to stay local. And we think what's happening here is that some individuals are able to find open water during the winter. Even if they're farther north, there might be rivers that are open or lakes with aerators that are keeping the water open so it's not freezing over. The other thing David did was classify birds depending on how far they moved, and found that 60% of the individuals moved at least 100 kilometers, which we referred to as long-distance migrants. 15% made regional movements, 25 to 100 kilometers, and then 20% had just local movements less than 25 kilometers, and then 5% sort of changed what they did over time. Looking at phenology, if we look at when they left in the fall to their breeding areas, we see a clear trend with breeding latitude. So individuals that are farther north left earlier, which sort of makes sense, right? So the winter's occurring a little bit sooner. They also arrived later, so birds that are farther north had to wait longer before they could access resources, so that all makes sense. And then the duration over which they were away from their summer or breeding areas followed that same pattern, so individuals that are farther north are spending more time on their winter areas than individuals that are farther south. In terms of the effect of breeding status, this also made quite a bit of sense. Individuals that were classified as breeders left later, so essentially here the thought is that they're probably trying to continue to access food and for the cygnets so that they could actually have the energy reserves to migrate. Breeders also arrive back in the spring earlier, most likely to be able to set up territories to raise their young. And so again, when you think of like how far or how long do they spend away from their summer or breeding territories, breeders are spending the shortest time away from their summer or breeding territories because they're leaving later and arriving earlier in the spring. If you look at overwintering conditions and the type of area where we found swans, essentially there's this sort of line that goes across Iowa below which swans were able to access open water quite easily on natural areas, whereas above that line, swans were trying to looked like they were targeting rivers or other areas that were kept open artificially using aerators or other things. So again, swans have to find areas to feed and find open water in the winter, and so that's really driving a lot of their movement patterns. So to summarize, we have a population that's clearly a partial migratory population. Some individuals are migrating and moving long distances, and others are able to stay close by and not migrate if they can find open water and sources of food. And there's a lot of variation between and among individuals and regions. A lot of the differences among individuals are due to either their breeding status or the latitude of their breeding and summer ranges. And then rivers and artificial areas are the sources that allow some individuals not to migrate as far if they're farther north. To find more detail, or if you want to know more, seek out David when he's got a little more of a voice, or he's recently had a paper published in ornithology that we'd be happy to share if you're interested in learning more. And so with that, got some other pictures that David put in here to just kind of see some of the capture efforts from the collaring and capturing here. And one of the other things I would want to mention, I think I missed one in here. No? I think that's at the end. There's a picture of David with his children. And some of this work was challenging to do in the field, partly because it also occurred during COVID. And so kudos to David for figuring out how to make that work and be able to make this a successful study. Lots of important funding sources to help put this together and lots of partners to help make it a successful project. So again, so thanks. I'm happy to try and answer any questions, and if I can't answer them, hopefully others in the room can also help.
Check, check, check. Yes, we have 2 mics. Great.
John, are you raising your hand to help answer questions here?
No, this is a question I think I asked David before. Part of the earlier, just for background, I worked for Three Rivers. We dealt with the red rock birds for many years, and then the Canadian birds came in, and that's when they started migrating. From the genetic work, are most of the birds that are migrating long distances genetic Alaskan stock, or is still some red rock left in them?
I mean, that's a great question. That's one of the things David really wanted to hope, to address with the genetic data that he's collected. This is a case where I'm going to try and answer as best I can, because, but I'm going to look to David to nod or to shake his head. There are clear genetically distinct populations that we were able to identify from that work, which compared swans in Minnesota to swans in the high plains and the Rocky Mountain and Pacific population. So you could see the signature in Minnesota was largely from the Pacific Coast population with some intermixing of Rocky Mountain population. But at the individual level, I think it was really hard to sort out whether those genetic differences could be explaining some of the variation in migration strategies. So I think, David looked at that sort of quickly, coarsely, and didn't see a strong association there. But I think, it's complicated, right? So like what's causing some individuals to move more than others? There's probably a social learning aspect. There's a clear spatial landscape effect, whether there's an ability to stay close by or not. And I don't think there was a strong genetic signature, but I think that's something David's probably going to continue to look at with some of those data in the future as well. David, we say that's fairly accurate? Okay. Yeah.
Maybe you partially answered that. So are they collecting blood samples when they're doing banding, if they're still doing the banding, so they have genetic material to investigate? And then I'm from northeastern Minnesota, and from your maps it appeared that none of the captures hardly have occurred in that part of the state or even up into Canada from that area. And I know from experience that that population introduced itself. And so the question of our growing populations is substantial in terms of when they arrive and when they leave, and it's based on ice, ice off. And so they seem to come earlier and stay later in open water until they can locate for nesting. So I guess that's the other part of my question, is finding nesting areas or reporting them and following up on those and those populations, and where they go is a curiosity to me.
Yeah, so let me see if I can address that. So I think the first question was about our blood samples being taken, and they're not currently. I mean, David took blood samples for all the swans that we collared, so he's got genetic information from them. But in terms of current efforts, I don't believe that anyone's collecting more blood samples. for new swans that they might be banding. In terms of the Northeast Minnesota, I mean, the capture efforts, we largely relied on our partners, DNR, Fish and Wildlife Service, to try and figure out where to capture birds. And, you know, we captured 50-some birds, but that doesn't represent all of swans in the state. And I think that distribution is changing quite a bit, and one of the things we'd like to know is how, you know, like if with loss of winter potentially, what effect is that going to have on swan populations and their movements in the future?
Clinton, over in the corner, the other over here. Before we go any further, I'd like to just give a chance to acknowledge where he went. He's right here. Carol Henderson is right here. And we couldn't be talking about this project without Carol Henderson's input, so it's very important that.
And Carol was in one of the pictures. I should have pointed that out earlier on. Maybe we should, let me see if I can find that quickly. And you know, that the whole story here of the reintroduction is really very, very interesting, and I can't find it quickly. But yeah, so Carol was instrumental in that and bringing eggs. You know, there's pictures of bringing eggs back from Alaska and keeping them cool. And then they had to think about how to rear those, the young and et cetera. And then, you know, also Minnesota citizens contributed through checkmark funds and other things to get that important work done. So this is really one of those success stories that's got an interesting historical background and a lot that we can try and learn from it as well.
Hi, so I know that in this project, the birds that migrated 100 kilometers or more were designated as long-distance migrants, and I don't know a lot about Trumpeter Swan migration distances, but to me that doesn't seem very far. What are the migration distances like in maybe the Alaskan population, and do those differ from the ones that are seen here? Is there, I mean, do we know kind of what determines how far these birds are going to migrate, or is it really as simple as once they find open water, then they're good, or yeah?
Good question. So I do think the open water is a big driver, and so if we look at the figures of migration extent versus breeding latitude, I think that's what's capturing a lot of this association is really, you know, the farther north they are, the farther they have to travel. So I don't have numbers, but I suspect, you know, a lot of those individuals from the Pacific Coast population, they're traveling longer distances than some of the swans that we collared. But yeah, so I think, you know, they have to find access to food in the winter, and that's a big driver. But yeah, this is just kind of a first look at that and trying to think about what other factors are playing a role here. I think would be interesting to look at in the future.
I don't think you spoke about how you captured these gigantic birds, 40 pounds. Did you lasso them from your flat-bottom boats, or did you use musky landing nets, or what?
I'll be very clear. I didn't capture any of them, but David. So essentially, they try and get close when these birds couldn't fly, and then they had a shepherd's crook, so you know you could actually kind of hook them, bring them in to be able to capture them. So the one day I was out with David, we did see one swan, and as soon as we got anywhere close, it just took off and started flying. So it had not started to molt. So that was critical to be able to essentially be able to approach quick enough before they could fly. So it was critical to be able to capture them when they're molting.
Hi, I'm really curious about, if I remember the number correctly, it was about 5% of the birds you captured, they changed their migration pattern, right? And I'm curious, was that in one direction, like they were longer distance and then they became short distance, or maybe it was opposite where they were, staying year round and then they switched to either short or long distance? And then if you have any ideas as to what would drive the change over time of a migration pattern in an individual?
Okay, that's a great question. So of those 5% that had kind of different strategies, what did they do? I don't remember the specifics other than there was a little bit, they weren't all consistent. Like they didn't go from long distance to all of a sudden they learned of a new spot where they didn't have to migrate as far. I know there's a lot of interest in how different species learn to migrate. So like in the ungulate literature, there's been some really interesting work where they've followed individuals that have been reintroduced and looked at their migration patterns over time. And it took a long time for some of these individuals to sort of rediscover migration routes that were likely there historically. Again, I'm probably not the best person to address this, but like whooping cranes, they had the ultralights and things like that to help them learn these patterns. And there's some work to show that when older individuals are present that sort of know the landscape, they have more efficient migration routes. So there's clearly a learning aspect to this. And I can't say for sure, but I could imagine that as individuals learn of new spots from others or during their movements, that might allow them not to have such an energetically costly migration route, that could change things.
I had thought that neck collars had been implicated in winter deaths of swans due to ice buildup, and I'm wondering if that was an issue.
We didn't have any mortalities due to ice buildup. I know that was a concern early on. I think the very first year, some of the collars had quite a bit of ice. We had a couple people take some pictures, and we had a couple collars fail. We worked with the company that was making them. They redesigned it to make it so that they were more, they kept the water out and kind of solve that issue. And I don't recall anyone even sending pictures after that very first year of collars that had ice buildup.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for questions.